All right, so our topic today is transport in plants, and we're really going to focus on water transport. That's going to be our main objective. Now, water transport in plants is accomplished based on this idea, the cohesion tension theory. And so what we'll talk about is how a plant loses water and then how it replaces the water that it has lost. So the first point says that water evaporates from the leaves through the stomata, and that this process is called transpiration. And so I just want to remind you that if water is evaporating, it is a gas, not a liquid anymore. And so if water is leaving the leaf not in gas form, we wouldn't call it transpiration evaporation. If the water is a liquid, that's what dew is. So if you notice on the leaf of a plant in the morning, there's water on the surface of the leaf. That's the same idea. Water is leaving the leaf through the stomata, but there that's liquid water, not gas water. Now, it's for a different reason. Usually what's happening is that water that was supposed to be a gas got so cold that it had to turn back into a liquid as it was leaving the leaf. So this requires that you know what a stomata is. So I could see a link between this and the last section where I ask you, hey, which part of this diagram does transpiration happen in? So we would make a link between the parts of the leaf that we saw on the handout from class and when we observed cells in the lab, and so we would make the link there. Now, how does the leaf replace the water? Well, osmosis happens through the xylem. Now, xylem is one of the two types of vascular tissue that a plant has. Remember, xylem moves water upwards, whereas phloem moves sugar downwards. Every time a drop of water evaporates, it causes a pull of water. So you might know this from previous science classes in younger years as well, but water molecules like to stick together. The reason is something called cohesion. Cohesion is the idea that water molecules are attracted to each other. Now, the reason for this is because the water molecule is polar, and I'll mention that a little bit lower. So every time a water molecule leaves through the leaf because of transpiration, the leaf cells are going to replace that water via osmosis. And the way that it works, even though the leaf is higher up in terms of height and gravity than the water will come upwards. And that's because of water cohesion. When one water molecule leaves, it pulls the one right behind it up to take its place. So water travels because of transpiration pull through the dead, hollow xylem cells. So that's just reminding you that xylem is not living tissue like phloem is. Xylem is a hollow, dead cell through which water is transported. Now, cohesion is not the only thing that happens. There is also something called adhesion. Adhesion is when water is attracted to some other substance, to some other structure. And there are a lot of things that water is attracted to. The whole reason behind water being attracted to other molecules is because of something called hydrogen bonding and polarity. And so I'll just give everyone a chance to catch up, and then I'll talk about. So over to the right, there's a picture that shows a big tree and then the tissue that's inside the stem, so that's your xylem and your phloem, and then an even more magnified view with the words adhesion and cohesion. Now these little structures here, if I was to draw them, are little molecules of water. The big one in the center that looks red on the screen is a molecule, or is an atom of oxygen, and the two smaller white ones on the side are hydrogens. Now the idea is that in a molecule of water, for reasons that are beyond the scope of this course, the idea is that oxygen pulls harder on electrons. So when this molecule is made, the oxygen molecule is kind of negative. This little symbol that looks like an S where I curled the bottom all the way around is the Greek letter delta. It means partially. So the oxygen is partially negative and the hydrogen is partially positive. It's not an ionic compound, so it doesn't have a full positive or a full negative charge. But it is slightly positive on the side where hydrogen is and slightly negative where oxygen is. That means that if I have several water molecules together and they're oriented in a slightly different way, there's my positive part. The positive part of one molecule would be attracted to the negative part of another molecule. So that is why this happens. That part I wouldn't ask you to explain. I'm just telling you why it works. The idea is that water is polar. Polar means that you have a positive side and a negative side. Since water has both, it can be attracted to other water molecules or any other type of molecule that has a positive and a negative side. So in this picture, adhesion is showing water molecules being attracted to the wall of xylem, and cohesion is showing water molecules attracted to each other. Those two forces help water move upwards against the force of gravity. Water is attracted to the xylem. That means it won't fall back down as soon as it's been pulled up. Plus, water is attracted to the water molecule above it, and so that helps pull water up through the stem. So the result is that the flow of water is very continuous. So every time one water molecule leaves the leaf, it pulls another one up to take its spot. And the reason is because of cohesion to water and adhesion to the xylem cell walls. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions about this basic idea of what's happening in the plant? So then we are going to be a little bit more detailed about what happens in the leaf and what happens in the root. This part was mostly about what's happening in the stem. So all of this talk of xylem and phloem is happening in that part of the plant because that's mainly where those tissues run. They end up in the leaf, but that's where they're transporting things. So now we need to make the connection, what's happening in the leaf very specifically and what's happening in the roots. So we'll talk about the leaf first. In the leaf, we are focusing on transpiration. So this first part, you probably already wrote down what transpiration is. So we need to focus on why transpiration happens, what causes it, and what kind of factors could influence transpiration. The first thing that you'll notice is that there is a hormone. It is called abscisic acid. So plants have hormones just like you have hormones. Hormones instruct your body what to do in certain situations. And generally hormones are produced in response to some sort of stimulus that your body receives. Same is true for a plant. The plant will produce a hormone in response to a stimulus that it receives. This plant hormone causes guard cells to close the stomata. So we need to remind ourselves that on either side of the stomata, which is an opening, there are two cells that are part of the epidermis that are called guard cells. Either they allow the stomata to be open or they close it. Now, plants produce abscisic acid when they lack water. So down here I have two pictures of what a stomata looks like. This is closed and this is open. And you'll notice that there's a sunshine on the open side. That's because generally the stomata needs to be open during the day so that the plant can do photosynthesis. If the stomata is not open, the plant cannot receive, for example, the CO2 that it requires to perform photosynthesis. So the stomata needs to be open for photosynthesis to keep occurring. CO2 needs to come in, oxygen needs to go out. Now at the same time, water might be evaporating from it, but this is why the stomata needs to be open during the day. Now this is all based on water. So when the stomata is closed, that means there's not very much water. And what it really means is that the guard cells themselves don't have very much water. So think about what happens to a plant cell when it loses water. It's not turgid anymore. We would generally say that the guard cells are flaccid. If they were plasmolyzed, they would be dead, and so normally when a plant is just closing its stomata, not dying, we would say that the guard cells are in a flaccid state. When the stomata is open, the guard cells would be called turgid. And that's actually how they open. When they fill up with water, they puff up, and that's what makes them pop open and have a little opening in the middle. So our whole discussion about concentration is relevant here. When there's lots of water, that means the solution is hypotonic, water will enter the guard cells and cause them to be turgid. And so this is all controlled by this hormone, abscisic acid. Now there are 4 abiotic factors. In science, in general, if a word starts with the letter A, it can very often mean not. So if I split this word in half, something that is abiotic is not biotic. That means not living. So the word biotic refers to things that are living. So we are talking about 4 factors other than living organisms, which could affect the rate of water loss, in other words, the rate of transpiration. The 4 factors: light, temperature, humidity, wind. So the first factor, light, I already mentioned. Guard cells close the stomata during darkness. That's because photosynthesis is not occurring at night. Now, does that mean that the guard cells are closed every minute of the night? Not necessarily. Plants are still doing cell respiration and might need to open to release some gas that they've produced. But generally, stomata don't need to be open during the night because photosynthesis is not happening. That means that during the day, water loss, in other words, transpiration, is greater. Now the second thing is sort of a catch-22, because often when there is light, the temperature is higher. And it says that increasing temperature increases evaporation. So sometimes it's unavoidable to have water loss because the stomata needs to be open for photosynthesis to happen, but it's also warm out. So increasing temperature increases evaporation. For humidity, it's the opposite. If humidity is low, so in other words, if it's a very dry environment, then loss of water will be faster. And wind is another one. Wind will increase water loss because it blows on the surface of the leaf and will remove any water molecules that are sitting right at the surface. So when I think about those three factors specifically, those three factors have an effect on abscisic acid. If the temperature is high, humidity is low, or wind is high, abscisic acid will end up being produced because the plant will now lack water. So on this diagram, this point up here is talking about heat from sunlight. And so sun shines on the leaf. That is unavoidable and it's necessary so that photosynthesis happens. Now right here, it's showing you that we are getting water from the xylem tissue. So you can see those veins running through the plant tissue, and that is what is replenishing the water that is lost. And so xylem we see in the stem, and then it extends into the leaf. Now, one of the things I'd like to mention is the cuticle. We mentioned it before, like on the very first day when we labeled the structures of the leaf, but I want to remind you that the cuticle covers usually the upper surface of the plant, and this helps reduce evaporation. And so the cuticle is not an actual cell, it's a waxy substance that's on the surface of the leaf. And if you look at the leaf, now most of the leaves have fallen, but if you look at a leaf that's fallen, chances are one side of the leaf is shinier than the other side. The shinier side would be the surface that's closer to the sun. Now down here, this little hole here is a stomata. It's open to the exterior. And on either side of the stomata, we have guard cells. And we know that gas needs to be able to exchange through the stomata. That's its job. CO2 has to come in, oxygen has to come out, but at the same time, water can go in and out as well. Now these arrows down here are trying to illustrate wind or air movement, and the fact that it can carry away water vapor molecules with it. Does anyone want to ask any questions about transpiration here? So then we have one more thing to discuss in terms of water, and that one more thing is what is happening in the roots. And so if you look at the title of this screen, it doesn't even say water, it says mineral ion transport. And that's because water needs some help in the roots. In the roots, there is active transport of mineral ions into the root hairs. And this creates a hypertonic environment in the cells of the root hair. Oh yeah. So I'm going to illustrate what's happening in the root hair cells by showing you one magnified root hair so that we can see what's happening. Now when I say mineral ions, I mean things like sodium or potassium, I'm going to make a bunch of green dots here to represent those mineral ions. Now what we're saying is that if this here, this part here is the soil, there would be more of these mineral ions in the root already than in the soil. For something to move towards an area where it is already more concentrated, so these little green guys want to move in, that requires the use of energy. So ATP is the energy molecule, and for those particles to move in to the root of a plant, it requires energy. That would not happen naturally. That is active transport. Now the result is that inside the root hair is very concentrated, whereas outside the root hair is not. And we know that water will accomplish osmosis. The rule of thumb is that water always flows to wherever there are more particles. So since this is hypertonic to the soil, water that's in the soil will also move into the root, because water will always follow high particle concentration. Now, as the water flows into the root, it's not just going to move all by itself. It's going to carry those dissolved minerals with it as it moves through the root up the xylem. The other thing that happens is high water pressure in the roots. Lots of water has gone into the roots. That puts a lot of pressure. Now, the cell doesn't want to just keep accepting water, keep accepting water, keep accepting water. That would not be good in the long run. The cell could eventually burst. So water is going to get pushed through the xylem up the stem. So the water pressure pushes. So if we compare what is happening in the roots and in the leaves pull on water and the roots push on water. The leaves pull because every time transpiration happens, a molecule of water leaves and pulls one up. Plus, there's this pressure in the roots pushing water up. So we've got two forces acting, but they're both making water move upwards. The other thing that happens, and I would have already mentioned this, is that roots have a maximized surface to volume ratio. They have lots and lots of surface so that there's more water and more mineral ions that can enter the plant.